This is Justice Worriers, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Justice Warriors episode 20. My name's Andy, and as usual I'm joined by Leah. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there.
And Jörg. Say hi, Jörg.
Hello.
And we are, I don't even know how many weeks into full national lockdown at the moment, so we've been just sitting around moaning about how awful we feel and about how last episode left us confused and depressed. So we thought we'd start off this episode by talking about how confused and depressed we are about prayer, and then see where it goes from there. Does that sound all right?
Sounds great. And I love how you still start the episodes with a number as if we had a plan.
I think keeping count is not the same as having a plan. So, Leah, you were talking about your confusion from the last episode. Do you want to talk a bit about it?
Yeah. So I listened back to the previous episode, and I have to confess I was actually locked in the allotments on a very cold day. So that probably didn't help, and God did not answer my prayers to make my key work in the lock so that I could get back out again.
But did you get the parking space on the way?
No, I walked, and then I went in one gate, locked myself in, and then couldn't get out the other gate. So I was the only person there on a freezing cold day, and nobody came along to rescue me until I had to phone somebody to come and let me out. So yeah, I don't think that really helped.
But praise God, the phone worked. You know, you can.
But
still...
praise God, the phone worked.
Amen,
yeah, that's true. So yeah, I think I came away really unimpressed by my own idea. The more I thought about it, the more, because I was talking about this thing about us being in a relationship with God and asking him for things, and like a small child that asks their good parents for things, some things the child asks for and gets, and some things the child asks for and doesn't get. And I kind of professed myself to be fairly sort of comfortable with that idea, and then the more I thought about it, the less I did feel comfortable, because I realised that so much of what we've been talking about over these episodes is about us having a sense of what justice looks like, and professing to have some ideas about how that might play out in the world, and how we're part of bringing it more to life in the world and bringing justice into our everyday situations. So then my argument last time was that, well, actually, we don't really know, because we don't know what justice is, and so we don't know how to pray, and we're just kind of noisy toddlers yelling for a biscuit. Which sort of left me like, oh, well, I'm not sure that you can believe both of those things. So I ended up feeling a bit glum. But then, you know, as we said, we're all feeling a little bit glum anyway. Yeah. We don't get to go out of our houses very often, and
when we do, we get locked out.
We get locked out.
Best to just stay in.
Yeah, I mean, locked down and then locked in another place.
Locked out and locked out.
I know exactly what you mean, because I feel like I was taught when I was young not to trust any of my judgment, and that some man at the front would tell me what was right and wrong, and I should accept it because it was the plain meaning of the Bible. And one of the things I'm wanting to do is fight against that and say, no, we can see what's right, and these things that I was told were right seem really wrong to me, and that's okay for me to listen to that. So yeah, I understand what you're saying.
But there is.
What about you, Jörg?
No, just on this point though. I mean, there is. Now I'm defending it, even though last time I was arguing against it. But
yeah, you were the one that pulled it all apart for me.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So let me put it back together. No, I don't have. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is this problem that we can't talk about God being a just God and then act as if that justice is so completely different from ours. But then again, if we believe that God sees the whole picture, there does emerge a different idea of justice. And this is what the answer of Job is all about. but just so you don't think I'm trying to build something up here, let me tear it right back down. If we then try and translate this into the way the world is, and like post-Holocaust or something, then to say, well, God has got this clandestine plan where it all works out in the end, it just, then the only question I have left is, why is this better than nothing? Why would you choose to create something like this if you had the power to dismantle it or not end it right then and there? How is the heat death of the universe more than what goes on in the middle? Like, that just doesn't chime. So that the whole theodicy question doesn't go away. It doesn't, if you want to keep a powerful God. And that's where, just to bring it back to your question, Andy, where I went away from the episode, first of all, agreeing with both of you that it was one of our most mumbled up yet. It just felt very jumbled, and we're really looking for answers, and it is a really, really tough question. So I think we landed in an honest space. But what I came with it away from was that a theological question I thought I was done with, I don't want to say I'd solved it, but I was done with, came undone because I realized it leaves me with a very weak attitude toward prayer. And that is this whole idea that I feel theologically, like I said, much more comfortable saying, what if God doesn't have the power to do things in the world? What if he only can act through people? What if, in order for us to be here, he had to take away power and commit to doing everything he does through the world, just like he committed to saving us through incarnation, through coming down here? So that to me is a very Christian idea I can live with. And it was a very transformative idea in my theological studies. It really changed me. It left me in a pretty fragile state psychologically for a while as well, because I just suddenly realized that, there was an essay that wasn't getting done, and so there was different reasons, but it felt like all of that was compounding that, oh my gosh, if that's not happening, then whose help am I expecting? What's out there for me? Anyway, at the end of this, though, feeling like I was done, coming away from the episode, learning how callous of an attitude that leaves me with toward prayer, that I cannot honestly take the position that Andy took and say, God, do something here. Because theologically, in the back of my mind, I'm saying, but I know you can't. So you just don't. And that was my main realization in this, that it just leaves me in a very privileged and callous place as somebody who's doing well, fairly, in comparison to many people in the world. And then I say, well, I just don't have the need to pray like this. And yeah.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, so yeah, you can get away with thinking God doesn't act in the world because you don't need him to, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, like, tomorrow you will, though, right? That's the other part of that story, but yeah.
Well, no, I don't know. I mean, in case of a personal illness or something like that, I don't think I would want to be rebelling like this. But also on account that our lives are fairly, livable. Mm-hmm. So we might as well enjoy the beauty of it and take it all from God, the good and the bad, as his gift to us, but not as the sort of micromanaged story that he creates for us. But as a fluidity and the beauty of his creation that will sometimes throw good and bad things at you. So I'm okay with that, but it just makes me such a callous bystander to many other things, because I cannot weep with you in the same way. I can weep over evil, but I can't weep toward God, because I don't really believe he has the power to do anything about it.
And I think one thing that you said that did leave me feeling hopeful was when we touched on it. You touched on it briefly when you were explaining your answer to the theodicy problem about incarnation. And I think one thing that I feel for myself, having never ever really experienced terrible suffering, I like to think that the incarnation and the fact that Jesus has been through terrible suffering and is relatable when you're in suffering would be a helpful and and very comforting thing. But having never been through that, I can't speak from experience.
Can we have some quick definitions of theodicy and incarnation, please?
Yeah, that's your job.
That's my job. Well, theodicy is the question of how you reconcile the idea of God's justice with the evil in the world. That's sort of the shorthand for that whole discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And incarnation is, of course, the becoming flesh of God, carnal. So that God becomes man or human and comes down to earth, which is, I mean, that's a fundamental Christian principle, along with God then dying on the cross. And we have had so many discussions within Christianity how you think that and where God came from it. Like, if Jesus is God, how does this relate to the eternal character of God? Was Jesus there forever? Then we get to the Trinity, and then we have to figure out how his spiritual nature reconciles with his human nature. It causes all tons of problems, which makes it really, really interesting, because you get the sense that maybe there's something there philosophical. If you want to reconcile something eternal, otherworldly, with the way the world is, there's no other way of doing it. And many other religions have a similar kind of struggle, how to relate eternity with temporality. Like in Islam, this is the question of the createdness, uncreatedness of Quran, and so on. But that's also why I think when you talk about the incarnation, Leah, in that way, then you also talk about crucifixion, and you talk about that silly hope of resurrection, that fleeting thing. And that then needs to be more than the disciples realizing, oh yeah, well, maybe it was all for the better and we can still continue Jesus' work. They actually are transformed by seeing another kind of world coming toward them. And that, I guess, is the hope. That's all you got left, in a way. If God isn't necessarily going to pull you out of the trouble, certainly not all the time, and not in a dependable fashion even, then the hope is that he's still going to come toward you at the end, even when everything seems lost, even when everything is lost. It's not. And that's that is the central message. But like you, I don't know when this starts to feel cheap and when it's actually profound.
I think last time left me realizing, or just being another aspect of something that I think I'm trying to learn. I've probably been trying to learn for the last maybe 5 years, which is that God is good. Or at risk of English teachers slapping my wrist, God is nice, because they don't like people to use the word nice. But it really expresses what I mean, because somehow I ended up with this idea that God is horrible, but in a kind of stern way that's justifiable and right.
Because you're bad.
Yeah, and so I feel like I'm trying to learn that God is just not anything like that, right? And this is, I believe I see that in the Bible, and I see that in the history of the human race's developing understanding of God. But the difficulty with that concept last week was, in order for God to be nice, God would have to act in the world, and that doesn't seem to make any sense. So then we're back to the same problem.
Those that die by wearing the badge, they're the chosen ones. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge, they're the chosen ones. The justified, those that died, they're the chosen whites.
But this week we thought we'd talk about spiritual forces acting in the world, which is even further along that axis of how can this be a thing? So thoughts on spiritual warfare, spiritual powers. Where are we going to go with this?
Well, I think a little bit like we're struggling with the prayer thing, because we can see, like you said last week, Andy, that the Bible is full of stories where God answers prayer very straightforwardly. God doesn't kind of give you the yes, no, wait thing. He actually just answers the prayer. So we are struggling with this because we read it in the Bible, and we are trying to kind of have a discussion that is in the light of what the Bible says. So if we're going to talk about spiritual forces, then you have to start with Jesus and the fact that Jesus spent a phenomenal amount of his time on earth, not just healing people who were blind or lame, but doing this thing that feels very odd to modern ears, of driving out demons. So if we're going to wrestle with the Bible, we have to somehow talk about that. What does that mean?
Yeah, talking to demons sometimes, and then moving from a person into some pigs and things like that. Yeah, it really seems when you read the whole of the Bible that the authors believed in these actual things that actually exist and interact with the physical world, that live in some kind of spiritual world, and that Jesus did too. Right? I mean, can we wriggle out of that?
No, the same way we can't wriggle out of him telling us to pray, like Leah just said, and like a good father who would not give you a snake when you ask for a fish you'll just get. If you ask nicely, if you ask right. And yet, like many other things, we have real trouble translating this into where we are. And it's been translated for us many times, and the most recent attempt at translating it, I mean, to begin with, my worry about all of this is this whole Pentecostal spiritual warfare stuff that I understand. I know where it comes from. I used to be a Pentecostal myself. I get the mentality that's behind that.
Do you want to just explain a little bit what that is, what you mean by that?
Well,
for people who aren't familiar with what Pentecostals...
Yeah, I mean, Pentecostalism is an expression of Christianity that wants to recenter around the Holy Spirit and all those stories in the Bible that are about spiritual gifts. So things like the church in its liberal wings would rather forget about prophecy, speaking in unknown languages or undecipherable languages, perhaps. The power to heal that is attributed to certain people who have the spiritual power strong enough to do that. Exorcising demons, discerning whether there's a demon or just an illness. And all of this stuff is very much practiced in large wings of Christianity today. And especially in the global south. It is one of the central forces for why Christianity manages to translate into many local cultures, because it then tends to absorb local cosmologies, beliefs about spiritual entities into the category of the spirit of the demon. And in that way, you can keep that worldview in some way. You can say, well, this person bewitched me, but it's translated into this idea of a demon. And then, I mean, if you watch Nigerian films, for example, Nollywood films, there's tons and tons of stuff. I watch that with my students sometimes, where you get this weird fusion of a Western idea of esoteric Satanism with African traditional religious practices, where you can really see that translation in place. But that's what Pentecostalism does. It kind of re-emphasizes the reality of spiritual forces in the world, and that we can, to some extent, engage with them if we have the power of the Holy Spirit, which is God's Spirit. And in the West, probably because this category has been translated into almost like a gnomic figure, or the devil with the horn on his head, it's completely foreign and just ridiculous to many ears. And yeah, what do we do with it? And my worry, just to close that parenthesis, is there's a lot of stuff that's wrong with that spiritual warfare teaching, because it does want to engage in with the world in a way that makes everything predictable and manipulable, and it gives you easy explanations. So this person is struggling with a mental illness because they're really possessed. And
it's about sort of talismans and spells, in a sense, if you wanted to translate it into a different set of language. It's about having control over that whole sphere through these methods and ways of doing things and things that you say. And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's some different ideas or different subcategories of it. So first of all, then there's those people who say, as a good Bible-believing, born-again, or whatever Christian, you can also be afflicted by demons. That was a huge debate, and this comes back to a guy named Derek Prince who taught, yes, you can. And that suddenly made it possible for, I don't know, some elder in the church, if they were having a rough time or whatever, you could actually drive out a demon as another way of perhaps praying for healing. and then there's all the stories, of course, how that helped this person so and so. Then there's the spiritual mapping people who go through towns, and this comes back to a guy called Charles Peter Wagner, who thought, well, maybe this is all very much territorial, so it turns geographic. And then for some strange reason, they're always against Masons, and like there's an anti-liberal drift in there, which is also interesting. So it's against Freemasons and lodges and Washington. I mean, if you were around in the 1990s and you watched, you read Frankie Peretti books, they were full of this. And the concept here was always, behind everything you see, there's darker realities, there are actual spiritual forces at play. Don't trust what the news are telling you. There's something else. There's another story underneath.
Mm.
So have you read the Frank Peretti books, Jörg?
I have, yeah. A couple of them.
Because I was wondering whether I was the only one. Yeah, have you read them?
No, I haven't. No. Sorry.
Yeah.
So essentially, my memory of, I think I read one of them, was something like what Jörg said. There's this secret world behind the physical world,
Yeah.
where there's a war going on. And it's like a computer game. So if you pray, you charge up, exactly like a computer game character, you charge up the power that the angels use to fight.
Yeah.
And the overriding sense from those books, which, by the way, are kind of they're like a literalistic, fictionalized account of what's really going on in the world from a literal Christian perspective. The thing about them that is that is the strongest impression for me is that world is completely, like a computer game, completely predictable and sensible. Now, obviously, as humans, we can't always see the logic, but the logic is absolutely there and it's straightforward. And we just need to realise this secret world is going on, and everything will make sense.
Exactly. And then when you engage with it, it's so neat. When you engage with it, you can win. If you know how to pull the triggers. And the storylines are predictable too. You know, there's always some hiccup as well, that the armies aren't just quite ready because the people weren't praying, or people were letting their guards down and letting these demons in. And it would then explain, like, drug addictions, rebellious teenagers, homosexuality, all sorts of things get then explained with these spiritual entities. And then you're into really, really troublesome territory.
Yeah, and for me it was very much a continuation of that thing of, there's a man at the front telling you, you don't understand, but I do. It's okay. I'll tell you the plain meaning of the Bible. I'll tell you what's really going on.
Yeah.
And you do what I say, and things will make sense for you.
And all the authorities of this world, everybody who's been listened to in this world, everybody who has a word of authority is in on this. They are actually controlled by these spiritual forces. And that's one thing I'm thinking about so much these days, in that this connects so well with the QAnon type worldview. If you grow up in this kind of thing, that BBC, certainly the UNO, all of people are in that, then it becomes so easy just to believe anything. As long as you trust the person who tells you that, and then you fight against this, and then suddenly we're seeing Christians no longer just do spiritual warfare as prayer, but they're now storming Capitol buildings and things like that.
And now you do what they tell you. And now you do what they told you.
So we have a massive problem with it taken to that extreme, but you could then take it to the other extreme, which is kind of more the liberal wing of the church, which would say, well, actually, the people that Jesus met, that in those days they talked of them as demon-possessed, but actually they just have mental illnesses, and Jesus, whether you believe that he actually had some sort of supernatural power or not, was able to deal with those things. And it was just another part of his healing ministry, making things better for the individual people that he met. And therefore, we should use our time and effort and our prayers and whatever spiritual reality we might happen to believe in to make the world better for individuals as well. So that's for me the two extremes. But I have recently been thinking about these spiritual forces quite a bit, because it feels like there are such pernicious things in this world that you could describe as spiritual forces. And I think I might have mentioned this on a previous episode about racism and nationalism and British exceptionalism and lots and lots of, and sexism and lots of other isms, appear to have this force and this transcendence across time and place that feels viscerally real. And you can't just write it off as a fair number of people thinking the same thing. So is that more what Jesus was trying to get at when he was talking about driving out demons?
And when he spoke to demons. It's a bit hard to swallow.
Well, but here's one thing I'm thinking about. I mean, this sort of, and I don't know whether this is the right word to use, and we've discussed this, and maybe we'll end up not using it, because I also don't like it to say it's a metaphorical reading of demons. Like, it's probably more than metaphorical. But what that does for us is that instead of scapegoating individuals, instead of saying, if Donald Trump hadn't incited the masses, they wouldn't have, it's all his fault, we pin it all on him, we realize that there's actually something larger going on that needs calling out in this collective participation. Because then racism, sexism, those aren't things that just happen because one person does them. They're something that we all participate in, that we all have a role to play and to combat, and that the finger pointing isn't going to help. So in that sense, maybe speaking to these forces is not a bad idea.
And Jesus' pattern seemed very much to be that his very presence made these things manifest. Is a loaded word when you talk about demons, isn't it? But they made them apparent. And that very much chimes with the way I think about Jesus and his justice, is that whole thing about sight to the blind. It's that all of us are made more aware of the things that hold us back and bind us up when we meet Jesus, and that includes the Pharisees and the ones that you would appear to not need any kind of deliverance. Jesus also made apparent the things that held them back. So
this idea that I was kind of using of you're saying that this is a metaphor and therefore it's not real. It's very naive of me. So actually, these forces that we're talking about are very real. The fact that we don't have words other than metaphors for them is not surprising, because almost all of our words are actually metaphors. But I was just reflecting while we were talking about a situation at work where I feel that some area of our work is very sexist, because of the people who are there and the people who are in authority and so on, and I'm one of them, and I feel totally hopeless to do anything about it. So the idea that that's not a real force, that the sexism of that situation, or the power structures of our society, the idea that that's not real is quite naive. So this is a totally undeveloped thought, but I'm really excited about the idea that that these things that we're talking about can be real, and more real than how I'm making them sound at the moment.
Yeah, no, I think
you're
right.
Without necessarily being magic.
So, in a gospel way of looking at that might be that you, by your presence of being Jesus' representative there, are actually doing things to make them visible and make people aware of what's going on there.
I think I'm more like Pharaoh.
Just don't do yourself down. and also that maybe there's a place for praying against that spirit. I'm using air quotes, which nobody on the podcast can see.
Oh, we can hear them. We can hear them.
You can hear
you
them
can hear them.
in that particular situation. To say, God, what can we do to break down that particular?
That is really challenging.
You'd call it a stronghold, wouldn't you? The Bible
Yeah.
language for it would be a stronghold, right?
That's really challenging because it hadn't even crossed my mind. But it's also quite exciting because of the hopelessness. And one of the things about prayer is that you can pray in hopeless situations. Thanks.
So one thing that put me onto this was a really good Rob Bell podcast, which I really advise people to listen to because he tells the story lots better than I can. It's in the Jesus H. Christ series on his podcast. And the title is Maybe He Doesn't Want You to Follow Him, if you ever want to look it up. But he talks about the time when Jesus went across the lake to the region of the Gadarenes, it was called, and he meets a man who's living among the tombs, so in Jewish culture, totally unclean. And nowadays we would see him as having some sort of a mental illness. He was out of his mind and not dressed and had to be shackled. And Jesus meets this man, and on the face of it, it's a very kind of typical Bible. Jesus meets man gets delivered from demon, weird thing happens, demon goes into the pigs. You kind of read it and go, what's all that about?
Praise be the name of the Lord.
Yeah, praise be the name of the Lord. It's all fixed. But what Rob Bell does, and he goes through it in more detail, is that the backstory to this was that not long ago that region had had some sort of an insurrection against the Romans, which had been brutally and horribly violently put down, and the majority of the young men in the region had been killed. And just horrific things had happened. So small wonder then that the man who survived that situation is out of his mind, wandering around in the graves, the graves of probably kind of like his friends, right? So, it puts a whole different light on that story. And then the moment that's absolutely transformative when you read it in this light is that Jesus asks the demon, weird, but asks the demon, what is your name? And the demon says, Legion. So Legion is the name of a cohort of Roman troops, right? So Jesus is making manifest the much wider form of oppression that was going on in that society in a way that we kind of miss.
Yeah.
But that really got me thinking.
So Jesus is actually like pointing out, doing some kind of metaphorical thing there.
Well, even more so, the demon-possessed man is also doing some kind of metaphorical thing. Not a metaphorical thing. He is the one who acts as the pressure valve of everything that happened in the community.
Yeah.
He's the one who's taken the visibility of what everybody else is trying to suppress. He's the one who cracked under the stress. He's the one who can't push it away. And he gets then chained into a cave elsewhere. He gets put out because we can no longer have this memory among us. This oppression, the structure we suffered, we need to put it aside. This is not part of us. And he's not able to do that. It takes hold of him. And think about how many of, then think about drug addiction or some mental illnesses. It's, in the way that they are embedded. They are expressions of the forces that act upon us. They're not something, and I think that's where I probably differ with, with a sort of straightforward psychiatrist reading where they're read to come directly out of the brain and is biochemical imbalance, because we know the brain self-regulates. It has, by what it knows and by what it acts upon, it does also produce this biochemical balance. So when these forces get so big, it does act upon you, it changes you. But is that a demon or is that a constellation? It doesn't matter.
I wrote after I listened to this, I thought evil spirits possessing people were the living, breathing personification of the trauma and the socio-political situation that the people were living in. Because I think sometimes we forget that the Romans were like truly brutal, which is kind of weird because they crucified people, right? But kids draw nice pictures of Roman soldiers and Roman roads, and like any empire, we remember the good stuff. So we forget that Jesus was walking about an occupied country, run by brutal, murderous dictators, and so small wonder that there was a massive amount of, call it demon possession, call it mental illness, call it people, as you say, who became the pressure valve that had to release. Small wonder that there were a lot of people like that, and small wonder Jesus kind of faced it head on and did something about it.
Yeah.
But we don't see that. We just see individuals who have a particular problem that Jesus fixed.
And that's part of the problem, isn't it? Because we take those pressure valves. Thank God I'm not like that. Thank God that's not me. Let me regulate it in some way and make it predictable, either by chaining the demoniac to the wall or getting the proper explanation of where this really comes from, just so I can make sure that I'm never going to be caught up in this.
And Jesus said, for me and for my followers, that's not enough. We have to do something about this.
So that story is sounding very poignant to me, because I went on a trip to Kosovo when I was a young man, soon after the massacre in Kosovo. So my memory of that was this. Well, the most poignant memory is that the young boys who were there would come up to me, and they'd sort of fight me a bit, but also just play with me and just be absolutely fascinated by my presence in their house or in their town. And there weren't any men around. Basically, all the men had been killed. And that was probably what was fascinating about me. And I haven't really processed that experience at all, because it's too traumatic to think about. It wasn't traumatic for me. But yeah, the idea that there are real things happening in that community is not a silly or a metaphorical idea, right? There are real things happening to those people. Well, and the idea that they manifest themselves in this kind of way.
Well, our categories are all wrong, because the more we live in this sort of individualistic, materialist sense of who we are, the less we actually lose what spirits are, and they become these funny, cartoonish fairy tale figures because we don't build our reality around them. But if you think about how, and we said this before on this podcast, how much acts upon us in the way we were brought up, in the kind of love or care or lack thereof that we received, in the way we interact with others, in the way our devices make us do things. We're always just nodal points of whole systems, and yet we believe that, first of all, I'm an individual, I'm somehow free to act. No, I'm not. I'm a composite of biochemistry, of experience, of forces acting upon me, the way I walk out on the street, that I stay on the pavement. Like, the whole world is built to keep us in certain ways. So there's always things that are acting upon us. So I'm not that individual. And once I realize that, then maybe this idea between will and matter looks completely different. And this is something that anthropologists are working a lot with material turn, is the phrase for that they're actually looking at how do we interact with matter, and how is social interaction sometimes only possible through matter. Like, if you go to, I don't know, if you go to the post and you have a perspex screen and you interact with that, or the way we're actually interacting right now through Zoom, there's only certain ways, or Jitsi in this case, that you can actually act, and you're limited in that way. You don't know who I'm looking at when I'm looking at my camera, and so on. So we're never disembodied. We're always already part of this, of a material interaction. So then, if that's true, then what is that distinction that we make between matter and spirit? What is that worth? It's worth nothing.
And then there's the same thing about past and present as well. About how we interact with our past. So I read this the other day. The past is never just the past. It lives on in us and with us.
Yeah.
It returns and remains with us in a variety of ways. It's most dangerous when it binds its victims without them knowing it. We need opportunities, and this is what this person was talking about, need opportunities to see the ways that the history of Christendom and colonialism have mangled our imaginations. So this was talking about white supremacy and the church's history of, the church's history of white supremacy and colonialism. So in the same way that we don't realise the forces that are acting on us in the here and now, we don't realise the forces from the past that have an impact on us. And is there some strength in calling those things spiritual forces? Does that serve a purpose? Does that help us? Does it do something?
What other language
does it do some
we have?
useful lifting work? Would be the phrase, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to lose the spiritual almost, because it is so, because of all this Frankie Peretti stuff and the sort of gnomic representation of spiritual forces, it almost blocks our communication about this. Like,
I like the word visceral. It feels to me like visceral. It has some substance to it. That is.
Yeah, I've been saying real, haven't I? Yeah.
Yeah, real. We're just talking about real warfare.
Real forces.
Real forces. Some sort of
the powers in this world.
And I think that's what the New Testament particularly is trying to get at, but I think we lose it in this Frankie Peretti or this, we just don't get it.
And it's not metaphorical. We're not just trying to translate something and say, it's maybe just a metaphor for oppression. No, these are real forces. They actually are what make us. And some of those forces are good. And some of those forces are detrimental and destructive.
Yeah.
And it's not always easy to tell as well. That's a place where maybe the demons versus angels is a bit too simple of a scheme. And actually the Bible isn't that simple. I mean, this is one thing that actually that comes out in the Bible Project Spiritual Warfare podcast.
Yeah.
The Satan is just the accuser. They're all demigods that work under God. They're all part of the forces of the world. They're the council. They're the heavenly council. And that's an Old Testament picture, right? So that's before the arrival of this very straight dualism that drives a lot of the New Testament, that actually there was this idea that, yes, God is the only one who's truly God. So in that sense, it's a monotheistic world. But there's all this spiritual council underneath that does all the things in the world. And they're not always bad or good. And sometimes God uses them too, like he uses the Satan to test Job. That's actually, sometimes the Old Testament is easier for us. That's weird.
But Paul uses this in Ephesians, doesn't he, in the famous passages that kind of a lot of this spiritual warfare, Pentecostalism that you were talking about before, comes from the idea that our battle is not against flesh and blood, and it's against principalities and powers. Yeah,
but listen to what he says. But against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms.
So he's talking more about empire, right?
He's talking about all power, yeah.
Because remember, they're still under the Romans at this point.
Yeah.
So there's still a very real sense of being under some kind of oppressive force.
Yeah. And this isn't, that's the other thing that I just realized this week, again, through listening to Bible Project podcast, but also then looking back at this verse, is that Ephesians isn't actually about spiritual warfare. This is like his closing thought. He's like, the whole theme of Ephesians is, let's work together as Christians, whether you're Jewish, whether you're non-Jewish Christian, whether you're slave, whether you're master. This isn't the thing I want you to focus on. I want you to focus on what we as a church can do against the powers and principalities that are behind how this world is working. And these aren't just demon things. These aren't just heavenly type vague forces. These are actual powers.
Because actually, we, and the word is even right there, we demonize these people, really, don't we? So,
wow, yeah.
If you think about what we were talking about a minute ago, that people who might manifest themselves sometimes as having a kind of some sort of mental illness issues, and we're definitely not saying that this applies for all mental illness, but on some occasions it's that sort of pressure valve release thing that you were talking about. Also, you could look at the people who stormed the Washington Capitol. That a pressure release is sometimes that turn to violence and that banding together to do something that feels like you're achieving something, right? But it's also being driven by these forces, and if we're not careful, we demonize those people too, and we don't recognize our own captivity to all sorts of things that hold us back from loving one another and giving people the benefit of the doubt and seeing God's blessing in people. And
so if my question is, like, this idea that these real forces, let's call them, exist, and even treating them as personalities or somewhere along the line towards personalities might be helpful. The place where I think that might be helpful to me is when I think about my own level of freedom and my own, like, what my life is really about. You know, if I believe the myth that my life is really about like this infinitely powerful will that can just choose what happens or choose its response to every situation, let's say.
Well, you having that.
Me, yeah. Then I'll miss what's really happening in my life, which is that there are all these things happening to me. And if I take the viewpoint that I sometimes... So the irony of this, by the way, in terms of whether you're this infinitely powerful will or whether you're like blown around by forces, is if you take a fully materialistic viewpoint, like I sometimes take, like a mechanistic viewpoint, then you're entirely ruled by the past and the forces happening around you, and there's nothing in there. So the kind of ultra scientific view, it like fits in well with the ultra spiritual view.
The cultural view is you are this all powerful. I was listening to something that I don't know if it was played in your house this week as well, that one of our kids had as a motivational thing for careers. And I mean, it was just, you have control of your own destiny. You can be anything that you want to be, anything that you set your mind to, you can achieve. It's all just whether it was basically like whacking them over the head. I mean, I don't know how it was meant to be motivational, but it would have made me feel like...
And if you haven't achieved that yet, then that is the problem. It's you.
I know. I'll just go back and lock myself in the allotment, I think.
It reminds me of not having enough faith, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that goes back to what you said the other week about being taught that our Christianity was incredibly countercultural, and now realising that it was very, very middle of cultural, because it all fits with this thing. If you can manipulate these spiritual forces, if you have a strong enough will, if you can fast enough, if you can pray for long enough, if you can set your goals, you will achieve this, and
you will get God to do X and Y and Z.
Yeah, and it's the spirit of the world that puts you right at the centre, and it's just nonsense and horrid, because at some point you get to middle age and you realise that you've failed in all.
You start making a podcast,
and all you got left
with your other failure friends.
Yeah, and then you can watch all these. Then you can watch all these Hollywood films where everybody just kind of turns it around last minute, or they study that one night and then they pass, even though they were never gonna get through college or whatever. But I want to come back to something you said, Leah, because I think that's important, and we shy away from this. Because I think it's important that we get our mindset out of this closed demonizing idea. So you said, I'm not saying this is mental health is caused by this, but maybe to some it applies. I think if we take this seriously, all of our mental states are driven by forces outside of ourselves, whether they're good or not good. This is not saying they're demonic forces. This is saying we're realizing that we are not always in control of our health, whether it's physical or mental. And when we break down in this crisis, it becomes more apparent to us, because we realize actually it's not that simple. And you go and, I don't know, you have psychotherapy and they tell you, well, try and do this, and then you try it and maybe it doesn't work. Or you take a drug that does help, but it also seems to counteract against your natural rhythm that produces, let's say, an endorphin or whatever, and you realize, okay, this isn't the end all. And where can I grab this problem? It's never just one thing. There's so much going on. What do I do with it? how can I name this? And now there's a problem though, because then if we put this Christian simple answer on top of it that says, is it a demon or is it not? Then we're completely leaving this picture and we're making a mess of the whole thing. And this is where this gets really tricky, because as interesting as Rob Bell's interpretation may be of the possessed demoniac in Gerasene, what is the answer? Do we really then say to the person who's cracked under the pressure, get out of him? Like that's not what works. That's not what helps. So this is Justice Worriers. So we've just arrived at a solution. Let's take it all apart. So yes, I think there's a lot in that we need to call out powers and principalities in that sense, and we'll also be aware that there's always a lot more that steers our responses, that we don't have the power. So in that sense, this crying out and saying, there's a force here that needs calling out, and I don't quite know what it is. It's making society behave in a strange way. It's making individuals behave in a strange way. All of that I can do, but the healing of it, I just don't know what that looks like. Because it can't just be the get out of him and all be well and cast into the sea or herd of pigs.
So there's a phrase that the Bible Project podcast like to use about Jesus, which is the truly human one. So my feeling about like for example, good mental health care is about listening to someone really compassionately and like being truly human with them. I feel like there's something there. Sorry, Leah, you were going to say something.
No, I was going to say, I think what I always find as I read the Gospels is there's two aspects to what Jesus is trying to do. And one is the truly miraculous. And that's the thing that the three of us are really struggling with. And we struggled with it when we talked about prayer last week. And as you say, you struggle with it now. But that does seem to happen in the Bible, that there are situations where Jesus just confronts these things and they get out, and we're told to go and do the same. But they feel like they're kind of not a metaphor, but or an illustration of the more day-to-day work that we are to do, dismembering these systems and forces, and 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 listening to people and caring for people and fighting against injustice in boring council meetings and writing letters to our MP, and the way we talk to, all those hundreds and thousands of tiny little drops in the bucket that we all are striving to do. But we can't get away from the fact, I don't think, that there is this miraculous, weird magic aspect to it that happens a lot in the Bible and still happens sometimes in this world, and that's the bit that we're all struggling with.
So that leads me to a question that's been coming up in my mind over the last few minutes, which is, if we have this new paradigm, and maybe we've torn it down again now anyway, but if we have this new paradigm that there are these real forces that really affect us, one of the and that we have that belief because we see patterns of activity and behaviour and events. One of the patterns that we have, at least as one of our stories, is that a small group of people get together and pray regularly and passionately, and then something big happens. So A, do we believe that story anymore? And B, how does that feed into our understanding of spiritual warfare and prayer, if it is real?
So on a good day, I do believe that, and I do even sometimes pray like that. Logically, I find it hard, but I do pray that way. Lord, I stand against the spirit of racism if I see it in a particular circumstance or something I've heard against the news. And I ask that it would be broken, and I have no idea what that actually really means in day-to-day reality, but I do pray it sometimes when I'm feeling strong. This week I feel it's all a total waste of time. But that's just honesty.
It's just the spirit of this week acting upon you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the forces of lockdown.
The forces of lockdown. But yeah, I mean that too, isn't it interesting? Like it's a very material little thing, a virus, right? And what this has created in terms of culture and deprivation, and I mean we're just in such way of interacting. We're such systemic creatures. I guess I have two things running around my head in answer to your question. So the one thing I'm wondering is, are we perhaps ignoring the cultural aspect of this a bit too much? So that in some cultures it is entirely appropriate language to call these things out as spiritual forces. And I'm not trying to be glib here, and it's certainly not an evolutionary concept, if you still live in that age. No, these are cultural things. These are things that how you were taught to see the world in what kind of instances. And when you dig into the philosophy of them, they're just as sophisticated as thinking through some of these things in biomedical terms. So I wonder if then calling out the demons and trying to drive them out is the wrong language for a culture that no longer has these beliefs, that no longer deals in this currency. But the story of the Gerasene, who has this legion in him, still speaks to me, because he's actually asked to tell, what is it that oppresses you? I'm not just assuming, I want you to reveal. I'm not just locking you away. I'm not just diagnosing you. I'm not just demonizing you. I want them to speak to me. I want to see what's going on. And that, I think, connects with what you were saying, Andy, with listening and actually calling out. Tell me everything. Tell me really what's going on. Tell me the whole package that's acting upon you. And that can be profoundly cathartic in one way. It can also be healing. And then the other thing, I'm very much with you, Leah, on that as well, that it is absolutely right to talk about the spirit of racism. What is Black Lives Matter about if it's not that? It's not just about George Floyd. He was very, very important in his, dare I say, sacrificial death in a way, like in the visibility of the brutality. But we are against the spirit of racism. We are against what's decolonizing about, if not, there's no colonies anymore. What are we trying to do if not getting a certain power mentality out of our system? So is that perhaps enough? Spiritual warfare? That we're saying, listen, brothers and sisters, we're not about to do just simple politics, and it's not just about who you elect or what. Let's stand together and call out the real powers. And then that can be forceful if that's spoken from the pulpits.
I mean, what if we were to call out in our churches on a regular basis the idea that this weird British exceptionalism idea that lingers? Yeah, it's so deep. If we were to name it, this idea that somehow we are some kind of a superior race and we did all this amazing work to civilize all these people around the world, and
yeah, or calling out the spirit of complacency among us who are just going to work every day.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's just a way of making it visible. I don't know what the exorcism itself looks like, because it's never as simple as, like, one scream and things are gone. In some instances, yes. I mean, like, that cathartic thing can really help individuals, but, like, in these larger systemic things, I don't know. But at least calling it out and
acknowledging forces, yeah.
Yeah.
But none of this answers my question, which is, there's a small group of people praying that this is supposed to be a hopeful point. Right. Is that a story we accept? That, yeah, it's out of keeping. Is that a story that we can somehow re-understand in the light of this? Is there a tapping into some of the positive forces that we've talked about in that kind of behaviour?
I think so, but I don't think Jörg does.
Well, then I rest my case. I'm trying to translate it because of what I just said. And let me again come back to the example of East Germany. There's a group of people that gets together and prays for peace and that calls out the injustice. And they create a sense of visibility that an oppressive government can no longer ignore. They're trying to beat it down. And then this group of people decides to stay on the spiritual high road and grabs candles, which means you have to hold it in one hand and you have to shield the fire so the candle doesn't go out with the other hand. That means you can't pick up rocks and hurl at the police or bottles or whatever. And that force swells and becomes a force that in the end makes the brutality of the government visible to everyone to see, and lets the forces back down. That is a very spiritual battle in this translation, because you're actually fighting, or civil rights movement, same thing. Those are spiritual battles, not in the sense of the Frankie Peretti, there's something else going on underneath. Look at it, it's going on right in the middle of it. What happens when people restrain themselves because they see in that sheriff not the demon, but they see that this person is grabbed by a force and a power that if I'm going to interact with him in the foreseeable way of pushing back against him personally, I will just get dragged into that very game, into that very power structure. And I'm relying on a different power structure. I'm relying on a different power in what I'm doing right here, right now. So in that sense, I think there is a lot in that. And that can also translate to the individual level, praying for somebody who's ill, because you are calling forth a different hope into their lives, whether that's efficacious or not in the end. But you're doing that. You're relying on a different story than the one that seems to be playing out in front of you. So that's me translating into very this worldly terms, because the other story, I would have to agree with Leah. I'm not so sure. If my role is to play the skeptic on this podcast, then I'm not talking about my better times.
So another thing that happens when a small group of people prays together is that they tell each other a story. So I've often been in small groups of prayer where we're essentially practicing empathy. So we're thinking about groups of people in need, and we're asking, we spend most of our time actually talking about their situation and then asking that it would get better, and we're practicing empathy. That's not the only story that you might tell yourself as a group, and there are others that could be really good, right? But that's an example of one that I've seen often. And I think I've seen extremely positive effects on people from that that could be completely explained by psychology, but that are no less powerful for that.
And the story still holds. The story still holds. You were
thing
standing with them in their illness, and you were calling forth a different outcome, or in the situation you were calling, not saying that was the causality of it, but you were telling that story all along toward an outcome that came. And if that outcome doesn't come, it's a much, much more difficult situation.
Yeah, I wasn't talking about healing. I was just talking about praying for the world generally, or whatever.
So
But
I'm just thinking about prayer and back to my shouty toddler. And one thing that strikes me is that if you see a problem in the world, you can either become complacent about it and kind of ignore it, or you can try and fix it yourself, and that, or with a group of people, but you yourself making something happen, or you can talk to God about it. And what I think prayer does for me is situations where I don't want to be complacent, and I know I'm pretty much powerless myself. It creates an avenue for me to do something about it and to engage with the issue and to not ignore it and to not give up into hopeless despair and cynicism. Now, there is a very real sense in which, even if that prayer doesn't affect anything in any great heavenly realm, maybe that isn't the end of the world, because what it's created in me is an engagement with that issue and a looking beyond myself to a power that's beyond me. And because I, as a person, will slide one of two ways. I will either be miserable and depressed that it's awful and the whole world's going to hell in a handcart, or I will have some sort of hero complex that I have to fix it, and why can't I just get on and fix it? And surely I'll just back to the whole beating yourself over the head because you can achieve whatever you want to achieve. And neither of those two positions are helpful, but prayer gets me to a place of engagement without falling into either of those pitfalls. I really hope that it's also achieving something against these forces, but there is a sense in which maybe it isn't, and maybe that's not terrible.
Yeah, and I maybe it is achieving something nonetheless. So it is.
But even if it isn't, I guess is what I'm saying. Even if it isn't, maybe it's still a good thing.
Well, what I guess I'm saying, if we're not thinking of these forces as just the sort of spiritual backroom stuff that only Frankie Peretti knows about, but we're thinking about these forces that are acting upon my vision of the world and the story of the world that I'm telling. So when I'm praying against this, realizing my powerlessness, I'm still calling forth a different hope that leads to a different outcome that speaks of a God that's coming toward us. Because that's the thing that I came away with thinking about our recording and then also listening to the spiritual warfare stuff and so on. And that kind of ties it neatly to where we started. If the story of the incarnation is right, then that means that for some strange reason, God ties his own fate to what happens with the world. Not in the sense that he waits for it to be right, because that's the story of the resurrection. He will make it right in the end. But there is this moment in between where we have to trust that it will be so. So what the stories that we tell about the world, they do matter. And the way we engage with these dark powers, they do matter because they're pointing us toward a belief and toward a faith that God is the boss of all these forces. And on a bad day, I will lose that, and I will gladly lose it even, because it's just too much of a burden sometimes to want to keep that hope, and cynicism is easier. But it gets me disengaged. It gets me no longer caring when I scroll through Twitter and see what's going on in Ethiopia. You just see another dead body and you just go by as if that life didn't matter. And when I am engaged, I want to cry out against that. I want to speak out against that. I want us to pray against that every day as a way of standing alongside people and calling out these demons, these spiritual forces, these real forces that kill people all the time, and say, nonetheless, I need to look forward to an end, and I need to tell a story of the world where this isn't going to be the norm. This isn't going to be the outcome. This is going to be the last word.
Yeah.
So that dualism is so naive, isn't it? That there are two worlds: the world that I entirely control my own behaviour, and the magical world. And it's just so untrue.
It's naive. It's untrue, and it's not even biblical. Because if it was biblical, you wouldn't need the gift of discernment, even in the New Testament, which is already very dualistic. The Old Testament isn't. In the New Testament, we have a very clear dualistic idea, and that's a way of keeping a lot of guilt off of God as well, it's like in a sort of history of religion sense, right? If he's just battling an equally strong counterforce, and that's very Persian of an idea, then maybe we just have to wait until see how it battles out, and that takes a lot of guilt away from God because it's actually the devil who's messing us up.
But then what's striking me as we're having this conversation is, if I take this stupid dualistic viewpoint and I just delete the magic bit from it, I'm still left with something that's at least as stupid. Yeah. And then we must get to something better and more true if we're going to deal with the world. Yeah.
But, and that's what I wanted to say, we still need discernment when we do this. So we still need to be careful that we don't overuse this idea, because then it gets just to be this bland. And this week we're praying against the spirit of racism, Or sometimes it is actually concrete forces where we should be doing things about them. And sometimes it's tough, but it's not evil.
I think it has to come out of a sense of engagement with things. You can't be doing it because you feel you ought to. It's
Yeah, I think I'd be more. It would make more sense to me to pray against racism than against COVID-19, for example.
Yes. Although there's a lovely heavy metal song where, I showed you that one with Kenneth Copeland and then the death metal music underneath. We praise against COVID-19. But even that, like if it wasn't for this silly spiritual translation, right? That because Kenneth Copeland stands there in the office of the Prophet Almighty and he denounces COVID-19 and that will make everything all right by the next Easter. I think that was the idea back then. But to call out the forces that has unleashed upon us, like how it has interacted with our systems. I don't know.
How it's exposed us. Yeah.
How it's exposed us. But again, it's a discerning thing. Like it can be completely silly and it can be actually important to call that out.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel a bit annoyed with Jesus for doing so many metaphorical things when he should have been caring for people and transforming his society. And instead, he was doing some kind of healing that's like a metaphor for the oppression of whatever. It's why aren't you actually healing that person?
He just made it too easy to miss, eh? He made it, easy to get the wrong end of the
stick. And the Gerasene would disagree with your interpretation.
So I think that my
interpretation
metaphorical
wrong for him.
Yeah.
So still that irritation with, why are you always doing metaphors? But then the question that I should ask myself is, if I wanted to change the world as one person in one lifetime, what would I do other than basically tell stories, which is what those metaphors really are, that people will hopefully pick up and tell to each other, right? I mean, what else are you going to do?
Yeah, and what else should we be doing?
So we've been talking about telling stories to each other and even our prayer being part of that, right?
Especially if we're praying with other people. And that's what I find hard about corporate prayer in church, is that I feel the stories I want to tell in prayer are very different to the ones I hear other people telling.
And maybe that's something we need to talk about when we unpack this, because perhaps there's something wrong in the way we pray. Because we do treat prayer like a slot machine kind of thing, right? You kind of say, this is what I want. Where does this fit? How do I put it in? And maybe we need more prayer where it's actually about discerning these forces, calling them out, looking at pictures of war and really stepping into those situations and saying, this is not okay, God. What's going on here? We're calling out this.
I've been wondering how I can apply this to next time I pray in church. What can I pray against? without making those mistakes that you mentioned as well. Sort of exciting idea.
It is. It feels half cooked, but I
think we're starting to talk about something, aren't we?
Yeah.
Just thinking about it.
I love that. We're just for the listeners' benefit, we are right near the end of this podcast, well, for everyone's benefit. So right at the end of the second over hour-long podcast, we might have started to have a
conversation. Shall I lead with a bit of thought onto the thing that we were going to finish with?
Sure.
Or am I cutting us off?
Yeah, the reading.
Yeah.
Yeah, who's going to read it?
Well, I was just going to say a couple of things about it, actually, because it strikes me that this has a real emphasis on recovery of sight for the blind and setting people free. And this is a reading from Luke chapter 4, verses 18 to 19, where Jesus basically stood up and said, "This is what I'm about." And I just find it really interesting that he doesn't kind of list all the ailments that he'd come to fix, you know. He didn't say, oh, I've come to fix people's legs and fix people's arms and feed the hungry.
And do a load of metaphors.
He came and said, I'm just coming to do some very specific metaphors, which are all to do with freedom and recovery of sight. So it says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour.
So there's a lot of proclaiming there, which is like a bit like telling stories.
And
And
maybe
there's
Andy,
one setting free.
and maybe Andy, they are metaphors, because otherwise, if you take this too literal, it would be like announcing a mix of a lawyer and a doctor, and that's not what this is about. Jesus isn't saying, I'm going to go to the Roman prison and open the doors, and I'm going. I mean, yes, there is, and this is where the spiritual connects with material. The Bible then says these things are interconnected. The people who are left blind in our society, the people who are locked up, that's metaphorical as much as it is physical. And by us always wanting to tell us apart and say, well, is there a real miracle here, or is it just the symbolic? We're falling into this bifurcated world between spiritual and material reading of this that we need to find ways of getting out of.
Yeah, and I like that there's freedom for the prisoners, i.e. the people who know that they're in prison, right? And there's also setting the oppressed free, which maybe I'm taking this too far, but you could read as the people who don't know that they're in prison. So there's the poor and the downtrodden who received the message because they, by and large, knew that they needed it, and there are us wealthy people who actually need it pointing out, and we need recovery of sight for the blind before we can be set free. We need to know that we're captives.
Yeah. Wow.
And there's an element of it that I feel like we haven't explored enough, which is that he's proclaiming something that's already true in some sense, and we haven't talked about that, but it's probably too late to talk about that now. Thank you very much. And so next, what we had scheduled for next time, in our third one about prayer, was what does this mean for me? What kinds of things should I be praying about? What way should I be praying? So, listener, we'll talk about whether that's what we really want to talk about in the next episode. But it might be. But in the meantime, thank you for listening. Thank you, Jörg. Thank you, Leah. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Andy.
Cheers, bye.
Killing in the name of, killing in the name of, killing in the name of.
You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
Now you do what they told you. And now you do what they told you.